Season 9 of Rick and Morty ends on July 26, 2026, and nobody outside that production knows what happens in it. The finale is called Field of Dreams. Not a Rick and Morty pun, not a wordplay title with a syllable swapped and a Morty inserted somewhere it does not belong. The exact name of a 1989 film about a man who builds something impossible because a voice told him to. Because something he lost a long time ago might find its way back if the right space is waiting for it. That is the title the writers chose for the last episode of a season that opened with Rick being blackmailed by the most dangerous version of his own grandson, placed him inside a false identity on an alien planet, bowling with strangers who did not know his real name, and left evil Morty locked inside a time prison with 8 episodes still to go. The questions this season is carrying have been building since May. Tonight, this video walks through all of them, one at a time, slowly. Welcome to Ricktopus.
Subscribing is free and it genuinely helps. Let us get into it. The firing that changed everything.
There is a version of Rick and Morty Season 9 that never happened. A version where the writer's room felt familiar, where the same voice that had anchored the show since 2013 was still in the booth, where the question of who speaks for Rick Sanchez was never a question at all. That version of Season 9 does not exist. What exists instead is something that had to be rebuilt from the inside out, starting not with a script or a story idea, but with a decision made on a Tuesday in January 2023 that changed the shape of everything that came after. On January 24th, 2023, Adult Swim officially severed ties with Justin Roiland. The announcement was brief. The network stated that the decision had been made and that the show would continue. There was no elaboration about the future. There was no roadmap offered to the audience. There was just the statement and then the silence that followed it, and then a very long period of uncertainty during which nobody who worked on the show could say with any confidence what Rick and Morty was going to look like when it came back. To understand why that moment landed as heavily as it did, it helps to understand what Roiland represented in the architecture of the show. He was not simply a voice actor. He was a co-creator, the person whose original sketch, a crude parody of Back to the Future called The Real Animated Adventures of Doc and Marty, had contained the seed of what would eventually become Rick and Morty. When Adult Swim greenlit the series in 2013, Roiland and Dan Harmon built it together, with Roiland providing the voice performances for both title characters and Harmon providing the structural and narrative intelligence that gave the show its emotional depth. Those two things had always been separate contributions, but they had also always been fused in the audience's mind. Rick sounded like Roiland, Morty sounded like Roiland. For the show's entire first decade, that was simply true, in the same way that gravity is true, something you do not notice because there is no moment where it stops working. The charges that became public in January 2023 had originated years earlier. Roiland had been arrested in 2020 following an incident involving a woman he was dating. The charges included domestic battery and false imprisonment. For reasons that are not fully clear from the public record, the case stayed relatively quiet for 2 years before it became widely known. When the story broke in early 2023, it broke fast. Within days of the initial reporting, additional allegations began to surface. These ones involving claims that Roiland had used his platform and fame to pursue young fans, including some who had been minors at the time of the alleged contact. Sources who spoke to reporters described a pattern of behavior stretching across years, involving social media platforms, dating apps, and direct messages that became progressively inappropriate. The domestic battery charges were eventually dismissed later in 2023, but by that point, the dismissal was almost beside the point. Adult Swim had already made its decision. The network had conducted its own review following the initial reports, and concluded that continuing the professional relationship was not something it was willing to do. Roiland was removed from Rick and Morty. He was also removed from Solar Opposites, the Hulu animated series he had created and starred in. He resigned from Squanch Games, the video game company he had founded. In the space of a few months, the creative empire he had spent a decade building came apart almost entirely. For the people who worked on Rick and Morty, the weeks that followed the firing were disorienting in a way that Chris Parnell, the voice of Jerry Smith, described as genuinely demoralizing. Parnell recalled a cast and crew meeting that took place during the period of uncertainty, when the future of the show had not yet been confirmed, and nobody was entirely sure whether the audience would accept a version of Rick and Morty without its co-creator in the lead roles. The meeting was the kind of gathering that happens when something has gone wrong, and the people involved are trying to figure out whether anything can still go right. Parnell described the atmosphere as heavy. The question underneath everything, the one that was present even when it was not being asked directly, was whether the show could survive without the voice that had defined it. Dan Harmon was asked about all of this this in a September 2023 interview with The Hollywood Reporter. He described himself as ashamed and heartbroken. He did not try to minimize what had happened or explain it away. He acknowledged that the situation had been personally painful. He also made clear that he was not going to let the show die. He said that work on the new season had already begun, that the writers' room had not stopped, and that his intention was for Rick and Morty to continue with the same creative ambition it had always had. He talked about the show the way someone talks about something they have invested too much of themselves in to walk away from, which is a particular kind of honesty that is hard to fake. The decision about how to replace Roiland was one of the more consequential creative choices the production had to make. There were options. One option was to hire a well-known voice actor, someone whose name would carry weight with audiences and signal that the show was taking the transition seriously. Another option was to simply recast with sound-alike performers and trust the material to carry viewers through. The production chose the second path. Ian Cardoni was cast as Rick Sanchez. Harry Belden was cast as Morty Smith. Neither was a household name at the time. Neither was positioned as a star acquisition. The logic behind the decision seemed to be that drawing attention to the replacement by casting a famous name would only make the absence of Roiland more visible. Casting performers who could inhabit the cadence without calling attention to themselves was a way of asking the audience to focus on the show rather than on the change. Season 7, which premiered in October 2023, bore the full weight of that decision. The audience response was fractured. A portion of viewers who had been loyal to the show for years found that the new voices created a barrier they could not get past. The feeling was not necessarily that Cardoni or Belden were doing the job poorly. It was that something was different, and different in a show built on continuity felt like a rupture. Season 7 received the lowest ratings in the show's history on Rotten Tomatoes, sitting at a rotten 33% audience score. Some of that reflected genuine dissatisfaction with the performances. Some of it reflected coordinated review bombing from a segment of the audience that had sided strongly with Roiland following his removal. The two things were happening at the same time, and it was difficult to separate them cleanly. What happened between Season 7 and Season 9 is a story of gradual stabilization. Season 8, which aired in the summer of 2025, showed measurable improvement in how the new cast was being received. Reviewers noted that Cardoni and Belden had settled into the roles in a way that felt earned rather than inherited. The performances had stopped feeling like performances of Roiland's performances and had started feeling like something the actors owned. Season 8 earned a 93% rating on Rotten Tomatoes, which was not just a recovery from Season 7, but one of the strongest critical receptions the show had ever received. The audience that had been willing to give the new era a chance had been rewarded for it. Season 9 is the first season of Rick and Morty that begins with none of that transition weight still in the air. The recasting is no longer recent. The controversy around Roiland is no longer new. The audience that stayed with the show through the uncertainty has had 2 full seasons to acclimate to the voices, the rhythms, the choices that Cardoni and Belden bring to the characters. When Season 9 premiered on May 24th, 2026, it did not have to spend any of its energy managing a transition. It could simply be a season of Rick and Morty. That matters more than it might seem. Season 7 and 8 were excellent television, but they were excellent television made under conditions that required a portion of the creative bandwidth to go toward institutional repair rather than pure storytelling. The writer's room was working in an environment where external scrutiny was high, where every episode was being evaluated partly as a test of whether the show could survive without its co-creator, and where the pressure to prove something was always present even when it was not being discussed. Season 9 does not have that pressure. The proof has already been made. The show survived. The question now is simply what it wants to do with the freedom that survival has earned it. None of this means the shadow of 2023 has fully lifted. Roiland's name is still attached to the original creation of the show in every piece of promotional material. He created it. That is a historical fact that does not change regardless of what came after. The audience that watches Season 9 carries the full history of the show with them, including everything that happened in the years between the pilot and the present moment. There is a particular strangeness in watching a show that began as a collaboration between 2 people and is now, in every practical sense, the work of one person and an entirely different creative team. The show has not tried to erase that history. It has also not tried to dwell on it. It has simply continued, which is perhaps the most honest response available to it. What the firing of Justin Roiland actually did to Season 9 is harder to measure than the obvious surface-level changes. The voices are different. The production timeline was disrupted. The creative team had to make decisions under pressure that they might have made differently under calmer circumstances. But the subtler effect is that the show is now, in a way it never was before, entirely Harmon's. The narrative architecture structure, the emotional ambitions, the thematic choices, all of these were always Harmon's territory more than Roiland's. Roiland had stopped showing up to the writer's room by season 3. His involvement by the end had been limited almost entirely to recording voice lines remotely from his home studio. The creative direction of the show had been Harmon's responsibility for most of its run. Season 9 makes that visible in a way the earlier seasons could not. There is nobody else to credit or blame. The choices the show makes, the questions it raises, the mysteries it decides to leave unresolved, these are all the product of a room that Harmon built and that reflects his priorities. Whether that is a good thing or a complicated thing is a question Season 9 is still in the process of answering. The season is only 2 episodes old as of this writing. There are 8 more episodes ahead of it.
Whatever it is building toward it without any of the structural uncertainty that defined the 3 years that preceded it. The firing that changed everything changed the show, but the show is still here. And in 2026, that alone is a kind of answer. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 1 walked through the moment that reshaped Rick and Morty entirely. The firing, the fallout, and the long road back to stability. Coming up next, we look at the other disruption that hit the show at almost exactly the same moment. A strike that stopped the writer's room cold and left Season 9 half-written and waiting. Section 2, the strike that stopped the writer's room. There is a particular kind of frustration that comes from being stopped mid-thought. Not at the end of an idea, not after something has been completed and set down, but right in the middle of it, when the shape of what you are building is just starting to become clear and the momentum is only beginning to feel real. That is where the Rick and Morty writer's room found itself in the spring of 2023. Season 9 had been started, pages existed, ideas had been discussed and debated and written down in the way that ideas get written down in a room full of people who are all pulling in the same direction. And then everything stopped. On May 2nd, 2023, the Writers Guild of America went on strike. It was the first WGA strike in 16 years, and it came after months of failed negotiations between the Guild and the major studios over issues that had been building for a long time. The core disputes involved residual payments from streaming platforms, the use of artificial intelligence in the writing process, and the systematic erosion of minimum staffing requirements that had hollowed out the writer's room as a working institution over the preceding decade. These were not abstract grievances. They were the product of years of watching the economics of television writing change in ways that made the profession increasingly unstable for the people who depended on it. When the strike was finally called, it was called because the writers had decided that the alternative, continuing to negotiate while conditions kept deteriorating, was no longer acceptable. The strike lasted 148 days. It ended in late September 2023 when the WGA reached a new agreement with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers that addressed, at least partially, the key demands around streaming residuals and AI protections. During those 5 months, writers on every covered show in Hollywood were not permitted to work on their projects. That meant no new pages, no room discussions, no development of any kind on any material that fell under the Guild's jurisdiction. For a show like Rick and Morty, which had already been through the disruption of Roiland's firing just months earlier, the timing was brutal. Adult Swim president Michael Ualeen and executive producer Steve Levy confirmed in June 2023 that Season 9 had been partially written when the strike was called, and that production had been paused as a result. The phrase partially written is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It means the season had a shape but not a finished form. It means there were sections of the story that the writers knew they wanted to tell and sections that had not yet been figured out. It means that when the rooms went dark in May, the people inside them left behind something that was somewhere between a beginning and a middle, with no clear ending yet in sight. What happens to a creative project when it is interrupted at that stage is not simply that work stops and then resumes. Something more complicated occurs. The ideas that were alive in the room at the moment of interruption do not stay perfectly preserved in the 5 months that follow. The writers go home, or go to the picket lines, and they continue thinking, even when they are not supposed to be working. Conversations happen in parking lots, and on walks, and over meals that are not technically writers' room conversations, but that shape the thinking anyway. When the strike ends and the room reconvenes, the people coming back are not quite the same people who left. They have had time, which is a strange resource in a medium that rarely gives it to anyone. Time to reconsider, to question, to wonder whether the choices that seemed obvious in April still seem obvious in October. For the Rick and Morty writers' room specifically, the reconvening in late 2023 happened inside a show that was also in the middle of another kind of transition. Season
Season 7 was in production during this same period, being made under the first post-Roiland conditions. The Room was simultaneously finishing one season and restarting another, which is the kind of logistical complexity that does not make creative work easier. Scott Marter, who had been brought in as showrunner, was managing both tracks at once. He was overseeing the completion of Season 7 while also working to rebuild the Season 9 development process from whatever state it had been in before the strike. Marter gave an update in May 2025 as Season 9 was entering its final production phase, describing it as almost entirely into color at that point.
The phrase "almost entirely into color" is a production milestone that refers to the animation process, the stage at which the fully animated scenes have been rendered in their final palette and are approaching the form they will take when broadcast. Reaching that stage by May 2025 for a season premiering in May 2026 indicated a production timeline that, while clearly shaped by years of disruption, had ultimately held together. The season got made. The interruption did not kill it. But what the interruption did do, in ways that are harder to quantify, is reshape the conditions under which Season 9 was conceived. A writer's room that is stopped in the middle of its work and then restarted months later inside a changed industry, inside a changed show, inside a changed cultural moment, does not simply pick up where it left off. It makes new decisions based on new information. The strike created distance between the first draft of Season 9 and the finished one. That distance is not necessarily a bad thing. Distance has a way of clarifying what matters and what does not. But it is a real thing, a gap in the process that left its mark on whatever came out the other side. The AI question that was central to the WGA's demands during the strike is worth dwelling on slightly, because it intersects with Rick and Morty in a way that is not accidental. The show's Season 9 promotional material included a statement from the production that was, on the surface, a joke. The tagline read that the season contained no AI slop, just grade A organic slop made by real humans with real human traits. It was framed as self-deprecating humor, the kind of mock-serious disclaimer that fits the show's tone. But underneath the joke was a genuine statement about the conditions under which the season was made. The writer's room that produced Season 9 had fought, collectively, for the right to protect their work from automated replacement. The joke was not just a joke. It was a flag planted in the ground. The strike also affected Season 9 in a more indirect but equally significant way. The 2023 actor strike, which began in July of the same year and ran concurrently with the WGA strike for a period before the two were resolved separately, delayed voice recording work across the industry. For Rick and Morty specifically, Steve Levy confirmed in July 2025 that voice work for Season 9 had only just started at that point, more than 2 years after the season's writing process had first been interrupted. The timeline from the beginning of the writing to the completion of the voice recording stretched across a period that encompassed a co-creator's firing, 2 major industry strikes, a complete cast overhaul, and a gap year in which no new episodes of the main series aired at all. Season 9 was assembled under conditions that would have broken a less resilient production. What does all of this mean for what Season 9 actually is? It means the season carries within it the evidence of everything that tried to stop it. The delays are baked into the structure in ways that are not always visible, but are always present. A season that was started in one moment, paused, reconsidered, restarted, animated over the course of years, and finally voiced in the summer of 2025 is not the same thing as a season produced under normal conditions. Normal conditions, in television, rarely produce anything remarkable. The seasons that carry the marks of their own difficulty tend to carry something else as well, a kind of earned weight that smoother productions do not always achieve. The WGA strike ultimately won meaningful protections for writers that had not existed before. Streaming residuals were restructured, minimum room sizes were codified, AI usage was restricted in ways that gave writers at least some legal ground to stand on when the question of automated content generation came up in contract negotiations. None of these victories were total. The industry continues to change in ways that make the economics of writing difficult for everyone who is not already established. But the strike mattered, and the people who participated in it, including the writers who left their work on Rick and Morty half-finished in a room somewhere in Los Angeles, did so at real personal cost. There is something quietly appropriate about the fact that Season 9 arrives, finally, in 2026, with a tagline that makes the human effort behind it explicit. The season did not get here easily. The road from the first interrupted pages in 2023 to the premiere on May 24th, 2026 ran through a firing, a strike, a gap year, a complete recasting, and a production timeline that stretched across more disruption than almost any comparable show has experienced in recent memory. The fact that it arrived at all is not something that should be taken for granted. The fact that it arrived with a 93% critical rating on its immediate predecessor suggests that what came out the other side of all that difficulty was something worth the wait. Season 9 does not announce any of this. It does not open with a statement about what it cost to get here. It opens with Morty walking through his house, noticing Rick texting someone he does not want Morty to see, and reaching for the phone. It opens, in other words, with a story, which is what a writer's room is for. And the writer's room, after everything, is still here. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 2 covered the strike that halted Season 9 mid-development, and the long road the production had to travel just to get back to where it started. Next, we look at the human beings who stepped into the most scrutinized voice roles in animation, and what it actually took to make those performances feel like home. Section 3, the voice that had to be replaced twice over. When a show replaces one character's voice actor, it is an event. When a show replaces the voice actor for both of its lead characters simultaneously, it is something closer to a crisis. And when those two characters happen to be the most recognizable animated voices on American television at that particular moment in time, the crisis carries a weight that extends well beyond the production itself and lands directly in the living rooms and headphones of every person who has spent years listening to those voices and building an emotional relationship with them. That is the situation Ian Cardone and Harry Belden walked into in 2023. And the fact that they are still in those roles today, in a Season 9 that is receiving some of the strongest reviews the show has ever earned, is a story worth telling slowly. Justin Roiland had been voicing Rick Sanchez and Morty Smith since the very beginning. The characters were built around his voice. That is not a metaphor. When the show was being developed, Roiland performed the original voices as part of the pitch process, and the performances that landed on screen in the 2013 pilot were not refined versions of something that had been workshopped and tested. They were essentially the first real versions that existed. Rick's gravelly, slightly drunk mid-sentence burp became a character signature so immediately recognizable that it was impossible to imagine the character without it. Morty's anxious, stumbling half-sentences, the way his voice cracked under pressure and then recovered and then cracked again. These were not performance choices that could be easily described in a casting brief. They were intuitions that had calcified into identity over the course of a decade. The production made a deliberate choice not to explain publicly exactly how Cardone and Belden were found, or what the audition process looked like. This was not accidental. Drawing attention to the mechanics of the replacement would have made the replacement more visible, and making the replacement more visible was the last thing the production needed in a moment when a large portion of the audience was already primed to scrutinize every syllable for evidence of absence. The approach taken was quiet and strategic. The new performers were introduced into Season 7 without a press campaign built around them. Their names were released. Their performances were offered to the audience. The production essentially said, here are the voices, watch the show, and then step back. What the audience found in those first Season 7 episodes was something genuinely surprising. Cardone's Rick was not an impression. It was not a note-for-note recreation of Roiland's delivery. It was something closer to an interpretation, a reading of the character that used the same underlying frequencies without being constructed from the same instincts. The gravelly quality was there. The mid-sentence rhythms were there. The specific way Rick trails off when he is about to say something he does not want to fully commit to, that was there too. But there were also differences, subtle ones that were difficult to articulate, but that registered somewhere below the level of conscious analysis. Cardone brought something slightly more controlled to Rick, a sense that the character's chaos was being channeled rather than simply released. Belden's Morty faced a different challenge. Morty is a character whose voice is almost entirely defined by vulnerability. The cracks and stumbles and moments of genuine fear that Roiland built into every line were not just performance choices. They were the emotional architecture of the character. A Morty who does not sound genuinely scared when he is scared is not Morty. A Morty whose voice does not carry the specific quality of someone who is perpetually slightly overwhelmed by everything around him is a Morty who has lost the thing that makes him matter. Belden's approach was to go back to the emotional truth of the character, rather than the sonic surface of what Roiland had done. He found the vulnerability by finding the character's genuine stakes, rather than by replicating the sonic patterns that express those stakes in Roiland's performance. None of this was enough for a significant portion of the Season 7 audience. The review bombing that followed the premiere was real and sustained. On Rotten Tomatoes, the audience score for Season 7 sat at 33%, which was not just low, but historically low, lower than any season the show had previously produced. Separating the genuine performance dissatisfaction from the organized backlash by Roiland supporters is difficult, because
because both things were happening simultaneously and feeding into each other. There were viewers who had given the new performances a fair listen and found them wanting. There were also viewers who had decided before a single episode aired that they were going to rate Season 7 poorly as a form of protest. Both groups contributed to the same number on the same website, and the number looked damning, regardless of what was underneath it. The critical response was a different story. Professional reviewers, for the most part, assessed the new performances with considerably more charity than the audience scores reflected.
The consensus among critics was that the voices were close enough to work and that the writing was strong enough to carry whatever gap remained.
Season 7 received generally positive critical notices, with the acknowledgement that the transition had been handled with more skill than many had expected. The disconnect between critical and audience reception was unusually wide, which is itself a signal that something other than pure aesthetic judgment was driving the audience numbers. What happened between Season 7 and Season 8 is a story about time and exposure. Audiences that had been resistant to the new voices in October 2023 were, by the time Season 8 arrived in May 2025, living in a world where those were simply the voices of Rick and Morty. A year and a half of cultural osmosis had done its work. Clips circulated. Memes were made.
The voices appeared in contexts that were not the show itself, in promotional material, in short clips shared on social media, in the gradual accumulation of moments that make an unfamiliar thing familiar. By the time Season 8 premiered, the new voices were no longer new in any meaningful sense. They were the voices. Season 8's critical reception reflected that shift. The 93% rating on Rotten Tomatoes was not just a recovery. It was a validation of the path the production had chosen when it opted for sound-alike performers over celebrity recasting. The bet had paid off, not because Cardoni and Belden had simply imitated Roiland closely enough to fool people, but because they had taken the time to develop their own relationship with the characters. By Season 8, the performances had stopped being performances of Roiland's performances. They had become something the actors owned. Harry Belden spoke about Season 9 in an interview in late 2025, describing it as higher quality than Seasons 7 and 8. The claim was notable not because of its confidence, but because of where it was coming from. Belden had lived through the scrutiny of Season 7, had navigated the difficult middle ground of Season 8, and was now describing Season 9 from a position of someone who has settled into something, rather than someone who is still trying to find it. His certainty had a different texture to it than the careful optimism of the early post-transition period. It sounded like someone who knows what they are doing because they have been doing it long enough to trust themselves. Ian Cardoni made similar noises in the lead-up to Season 9, encouraging fans who had been following Season 8 to understand that Season 9 would build directly on it. He described the show as being in a really good groove, which is a phrase that sounds simple but carries real information. A groove, in the context of a long-running television show, is not something that gets established quickly. It is the product of a writer's room that has found its footing, performers who have found their characters, and a production that has stopped spending energy on managing external perception and started spending it entirely on the work. Finding a groove after the kind of disruption Rick and Morty experienced between 2023 and 2025 is not a small thing. It is evidence of a production that did the difficult internal work required to get there. Season 9 is the confirmation, not because it proves that Roiland was replaceable in some abstract sense, but because it demonstrates that the specific qualities that made Rick and Morty matter were never exclusively his. The writing was always the foundation. The emotional architecture was always built in the room rather than in the booth. What Roiland provided was the sonic surface through which those qualities were expressed, and the surface has been rebuilt, gradually and carefully, by two performers who took the job seriously enough to make it their own. There is a particular kind of courage required to step into a role that an audience has decided belongs to someone else. It is not physical courage. It is the quieter kind, the willingness to absorb negative attention while continuing to do the work as well as you can, trusting that the work will eventually be evaluated on its own terms, rather than as a substitute for something that no longer exists. Cardoni and Belden had that courage. Season 9 is where they receive what that courage earned. The voice that had to be replaced twice over, once for Rick and once for Morty, has been replaced. The show did not collapse. The characters did not disappear. What exists now is a Rick and Morty that belongs to the people who are making it, not to the circumstances that tried to stop them from making it. And in a season that is already being described as some of the best work the show has ever done, that is a more complete answer than anyone dared hope for in January 2023. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 3 traced the journey of two performers who inherited the most scrutinized voice roles in animation and slowly made them their
their own. Next, we step back and look at the year the show went silent entirely, a gap in the release schedule that tested the patience of the fan base and raised questions about whether the momentum could survive a full year without new episodes. Section 4. The year without a season. There is a particular kind of absence that is louder than silence. Not the absence of something that was never there, but the absence of something that was always there. Something that arrived on a reliable schedule and occupied a specific place in the rhythm of the year, and then one year simply did not. For Rick and Morty fans, 2024 was that kind of year. The show had aired every year since 2013, with only one significant gap, the long wait between Season 3 and Season 4 that stretched across 2 years and tested the patience of a fan base that was, at that point, still relatively new to waiting. But 2024 was different. 2024 was not a gap between two stable eras. It was a hole in the middle of the most turbulent period the show had ever experienced, arriving at exactly the moment when the audience most needed something to hold on to. To understand what the 2024 gap cost, it helps to understand what the show's release schedule had come to mean to its audience. Rick and Morty had become, by the early 2020s, one of the few animated series with a fan base that treated each new season as a genuine cultural event. The wait between seasons was always discussed, always complained about, always tracked obsessively across social media and fan forums. But the complaining was itself a form of engagement. Waiting for Rick and Morty was something the fan base did together, a shared experience of anticipation that maintained the community's cohesion even in the absence of new content. The wait was annoying. It was also, in a strange way, part of the show's identity. The show took its time. Its audience had learned to accept that. What the audience had not been asked to accept before 2024 was a gap that arrived not because the show was being difficult about its release schedule, but because the conditions that would normally produce a new season had been comprehensively disrupted. The firing of Roiland in January 2023 had created uncertainty about the show's future. The WGA strike had stopped the writers' room mid-development. The actors' strike had delayed voice recording. The recasting process had added another layer of logistical complexity on top of all of that. By the time all of those disruptions had worked their way through the production pipeline, there was simply no season ready to air in 2024. Season 7 had aired in late 2023 and used up the material that had been furthest along in production. Season 8 was not ready until 2025. The year in between was empty. Adult Swim's solution to the 2024 gap was to offer the audience Rick and Morty in a different form. The anime spin-off, Rick and Morty the Anime, premiered in 2024 and ran for 10 episodes, matching the episode count of a standard season of the main show. It was produced by Telecom Animation Film in Japan, with Jason DeMarco of Adult Swim and Joseph Cho of Sola Entertainment overseeing production. The anime was not a continuation of the main series canon in any straightforward sense. It occupied a separate creative space, drawing on the characters and the multiverse logic of the original show, while operating with a different visual language, a different tonal register, and a different set of creative priorities than the American production. The anime was not a bad piece of television. It found its own voice, and a portion of the audience engaged with it genuinely and enthusiastically. But it was also, for a significant part of the Rick and Morty fan base, not quite the thing they were waiting for. The characters looked different. The storytelling rhythms were different. The humor operated according to different principles. Watching the anime in 2024 was something like being offered a very good meal at a restaurant you had not chosen, when what you wanted was the specific thing you had been thinking about for months. The anime satisfied something. It did not satisfy the specific hunger that a gap year creates in a dedicated fan base. What that gap year did to the community around the show is worth examining carefully, because community dynamics are not simply a social phenomenon. They have a direct relationship with how a show is received when it returns. A fan base that has stayed engaged during an absence comes back to new content with warmth and readiness. A fan base that has drifted, that has found other things to watch and talk about and invest in during the absence, comes back with a cooler temperature that can affect the initial reception of new material in ways that are difficult to recover from. The question the gap year raised, the one that the production had to be aware of even if it could not fully answer it, was which kind of returning audience Season 8 would face when it eventually arrived. The answer turned out to be better than the worst-case scenario. Season 8 premiered in May 2025 and was received with genuine enthusiasm by both critics and a significant portion of the audience. The 93% critical rating was evidence that the people who had stayed with the show through the gap year had not spent that time becoming more hostile to it. They had spent it becoming more ready for it. The anime had kept the broader conversation about Rick and Morty alive in a way that served the main main show's eventual return, even if it had not satisfied the specific desire for new mainline episodes. The gap had not broken the fan base, it had tested it. But the gap did something else, something that is harder to measure but equally real. It changed the relationship between the show and its audience in a subtle but lasting way. Before 2024, Rick and Morty was a show that its audience could rely on in a basic seasonal sense. It came back. It might take a while, but it came back. After 2024, the show was something that had demonstrated its own fragility. It had shown that the conditions required to produce it were not guaranteed, that the combination of writer availability, voice actor availability, production infrastructure, and network support that a season of Rick and Morty requires could be disrupted badly enough to produce a year of silence. The audience that came back for Season 8 came back knowing, in a way they had not known before, that the show's continued existence was not automatic. That knowledge changes the texture of fandom in ways that are difficult to articulate but easy to feel. Shows that their audiences take for granted occupy a different emotional register than shows that their audiences have had to fight for, or wait for, or hold on to through difficulty. Rick and Morty After the Gap Year is a show whose audience has had to hold on to it. That changes the quality of the attention the audience brings to new seasons.
It makes the investment feel more personal, more deliberate, more conscious of what it would mean to lose the thing. The fans who are watching Season 9 are, in many cases, fans who made a choice to keep watching during a period when keeping watching required something more than habit. The 2024 gap also had practical effects on the show's competitive position within the broader animated television landscape. The years when Rick and Morty was absent from the schedule were years when other shows moved into the cultural space the show had previously occupied. New animated series found audiences. Older animated series consolidated their positions. The conversation about which animated shows mattered in 2024 happened without Rick and Morty being part of it in any meaningful way, because the anime, however good, was not the main show and could not fully represent it in cultural discourse. Season 8's strong reception in 2025 suggested that the competitive damage was limited. The audience came back in sufficient numbers to suggest that the show's cultural position had not been fatally eroded by the absence. But the gap is part of the show's history now in a way that shapes how Season 9 will be understood. Season 9 is not just the 9th season of a long-running animated series. It is the season that arrives after the show survived the worst period of its existence. It is the season that answers the question that the gap year asked: whether the show could come back, not just technically, not just with new episodes and a broadcast window, but in the full sense of returning to cultural relevance and creative ambition, is a question that Season 9 is in the process of answering. 2 episodes into the season, the answer is looking like yes. The premiere was received with the kind of genuine excitement that suggests an audience that is fully present rather than cautiously evaluating. The second episode, which placed Rick inside an existential crisis on an alien planet with a false identity and a community he had built around himself, was described by multiple reviewers as melancholic and emotionally precise. These are not the words people use for a show they are watching out of obligation. They are the words people use for a show that is doing something real to them. The year without a season was real. The cost was real. The audience that drifted during the gap is not fully recovered. Some portion of the people who were watching Rick and Morty in 2022 are not watching it in 2026, and the gap year is part of the reason. But the show that returned from that silence is not diminished by what it survived. The gap tested everything about the production: the institutional resilience, the creative stamina, the audience's loyalty, and the willingness of the people making the show to keep making it under conditions that gave them every reason to stop. Everything held. Not perfectly, not without cost, but it held. And Season 9 is what holding looks like when it finally gets to become something again. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 4 looked at the year the show went dark and what that silence cost the fanbase and the production alike. Coming up next, we uncover the Rick and Morty project that almost existed before any of this happened. A feature film that was being seriously discussed at the highest levels before a strike and a scandal took it off the table entirely. Section 5, the movie that almost was there, is a version of Rick and Morty that exists only in conversations. In meeting rooms at Warner Brothers, where executives and a showrunner talk through what it might look like, in the specific kind of careful, exploratory discussion that happens when a studio and a creative team are both genuinely interested in something, but neither side has committed to it yet. That version never made it to a script. It never made it to a pitch deck or a production schedule or a release date announcement. It exists only as a set of ideas that were discussed seriously enough to matter,
and then set aside by events that nobody in those meeting rooms could have anticipated. The Rick and Morty movie that almost was is one of the more interesting roads not taken in recent animation history, and understanding what it was and why it disappeared says something important about the show that Season 9 has become. Dan Harmon confirmed the existence of these conversations in his September 2023 interview with The Hollywood Reporter. He described them as serious discussions, not exploratory chats or casual speculation, but genuine executive-level conversations about whether a Rick and Morty feature film was something that Warner Brothers and Adult Swim wanted to pursue. The model they had in mind was specific. Harmon described it as a super episode approach, referencing the way that South Park Bigger, Longer, and Uncut had been constructed, not as a departure from the television series, but as an enormously scaled version of it, something that felt continuous with the show while also being large enough to justify the theatrical experience. The South Park movie had worked because it did not try to be something other than South Park. It tried to be the most South Park thing that had ever existed. That was the template Harmon was thinking about. The appeal of that model for Rick and Morty is easy to see. The show had spent 9 seasons, at that point several seasons, building a mythology of considerable complexity. The multiverse, the citadel of Ricks, the central finite curve, evil Morty, Rick Prime, the history of Rick's family and the loss of Diane. These were narrative threads that the episodic format of a television season could develop, but could never fully resolve in the way that a single, sustained, feature-length story might. A movie built on the super episode model would not have needed to abandon that mythology. It could have used the mythology as the foundation for something that felt genuinely conclusive, in a way that a television season, almost by definition, cannot. Television seasons end, but they do not resolve. A movie can resolve. Harmon was careful in his description of the project to note that he would not want the film to be bogged down by canon. The phrase is interesting because it sits in some tension with everything else he said about the project. A movie built on the South Park model, using the show's established characters and mythology as its foundation, would inevitably be in conversation with the canon, whether it wanted to be or not. What Harmon seemed to be gesturing toward was a film that used the show's world without being enslaved to its continuity, something that could be understood and enjoyed by someone who had never seen the series, while also rewarding the dedicated viewer who had seen all of it. The Indiana Jones comparison he offered in a later interview is clarifying. Indiana Jones movies are self-contained adventures that work individually, even as they accumulate into a larger portrait of a character across time. That is a different thing from a film that requires you to have done homework before you sit down in the theater. The project was real enough that Jacob Hare was reported, via sources citing Deadline, to be attached as director. Harmon and showrunner Scott Marder confirmed the movie was happening during a Season 9 press interview, which represents the most direct public acknowledgement the production has offered about the film's status. But the path from the serious conversations of 2023 to the confirmation of 2026 runs through a considerable amount of wreckage, and understanding what happened in between is part of understanding why the movie that almost was is only now beginning to become a movie that might actually exist. The timing of those original 2023 conversations was catastrophic in retrospect. Harmon was discussing a Rick and Morty feature film with Warner Brothers executives at essentially the same moment that Justin Roiland's charges were becoming public. The two events were not directly connected in any causal sense. The film discussions were happening because the show was successful, and both sides saw an opportunity. The Roiland situation was happening because of a set of circumstances that had nothing to do with the show's commercial prospects. But they landed simultaneously, and the collision of a major creative opportunity with a major institutional crisis produced a paralysis that was difficult to escape from. The WGA strike arrived shortly after, in May 2023, which would have made any continuation of those film discussions impossible, even if the Roiland situation had not already complicated them. The strike prohibited covered writers from working on covered projects, and a Rick and Morty feature film, if it were to be made under guild conditions, would fall squarely within the WGA's jurisdiction. The conversations that had been happening in meeting rooms went quiet not just because of the crisis around Roiland, but because the legal and institutional framework that would have allowed them to continue had been suspended by the strike. Everything stopped at once. What survived the wreckage of 2023 was not the specific film that had been discussed in those early meetings. The creative ground had shifted too much. Roiland was gone, the show's voice cast had changed. The institutional context within which Warner Brothers had been interested in a Rick and Morty film was different in ways that affected what the film would need to be and who it would need to be for. A film discussed in early 2023, when Roiland was still the voice of both lead characters, would have been a fundamentally different project than a film discussed in 2026. 2026, when Cardone and Belden have made those roles their own, and the show is operating in a creative mode that owes nothing to the circumstances that preceded the transition. The confirmation that Harmon and Martyr offered during Season 9 press is therefore not quite the same as confirmation that the original film is back on track. It is confirmation that a Rick and Morty film is being developed, which is a related but distinct thing. The film that eventually gets made will be shaped by everything that has happened to the show between 2023 and now. The mythology it draws on is different because of the Rick Prime arc. The emotional territory it can explore is different because of Season 8's sacrifice of the Diane memories. The creative team making it is operating in a post-transition context that the film discussions of 2023 could not have accounted for. There is something almost poetically appropriate about the fact that the Rick and Morty movie keeps almost existing without quite existing yet. The show itself is built around the gap between what characters want and what they are able to have, between the plans they make and the reality that intervenes to complicate them. Rick Sanchez is a character who consistently constructs elaborate scenarios that he believes he controls, and then discovers that the scenario has developed in ways he did not anticipate. The movie that was almost made in 2023 and was then stopped by events nobody planned is, in its own way, a very Rick and Morty story. The plan existed, the reality was different. The thing that survived is something other than what was originally imagined. Scott Martyr's description of what he and Harmon want from the film is instructive. The super episode model, the Indiana Jones approach, the desire not to be bogged down by canon while still honoring what the show has built, these are the coordinates of a film that knows what it does not want to be more clearly than it knows what it wants to be. That is actually a reasonable place to be in early development. Knowing what you are not trying to do narrows the field of decisions considerably. A Rick and Morty film that is not a theatrical recap of the television mythology, not a departure into something the show has never been, and not a vanity project built around a filmmaker's personal vision rather than the show's identity. That set of negatives leaves a specific positive space that the creative team is presumably working to fill. What the film represents for Season 9, even in its current state of confirmed but not yet real, is evidence of a show that believes in its own future. Productions that are winding down do not announce feature films. Productions that are uncertain about their own direction do not commit publicly to theatrical extensions. The fact that Harmon and Martyr use Season 9 press to confirm the movie's existence suggests that Season 9 is being made by people who understand it as part of a larger project, one that extends beyond the 10 episodes currently airing on Adult Swim, into something with a different shape and a different scale. Whether the film actually gets made, whether it arrives in theaters before Season 12 concludes the show's run, whether it manages to do for Rick and Morty what Bigger, Longer, and Uncut did for South Park, these are questions that 2026 cannot answer. What 2026 can say is that the conversations are real, the director is attached, and the creative team has a working model for what they are trying to build. That is considerably further along than the project was in the immediate aftermath of 2023, when it existed only as the memory of discussions that the year's disasters had interrupted. The movie that almost was is becoming, slowly and against considerable historical odds, the movie that might actually be. In a show about the gap between ambition and reality, that is a more honest outcome than most of the alternatives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 5 covered the feature film that came close to existing in 2023 and what happened to those plans when Crisis and Strike arrived simultaneously. From here, the focus shifts entirely. The controversies are behind us. What lies ahead are the mysteries Season 9 itself is building, starting with the question that the premiere raised and has not yet answered about what Evil Morty is actually becoming. Section 6. What is Evil Morty actually becoming? There are characters in long-running television who exist to serve a function. They arrive, they create conflict, they are resolved, and the show moves on without them. Evil Morty was never that kind of character. From the moment he appeared in the Season 1 episode Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, wearing a patch over one eye and standing in the background of a scene that the audience was not yet equipped to fully understand, he carried the quality of something that the show had not finished with. The reveal that he was not just another Rick's Morty, but a Morty who had turned the tables entirely, who had weaponized the dynamic that defined the show's central relationship and used it to seize control of the Citadel of Ricks, was one of the most satisfying long game payoffs in the series. It took seasons to land. When it did, it recontextualized stabilized everything around it. Season 5 gave Evil Morty his most complete episode, in the finale titled Rick Mirai Jack. It was the episode where the central finite curve was revealed and then destroyed. The curve, it turned out, was a bubble within the multiverse, constructed to contain all dimensions in which a version of Rick was the smartest being in the universe. Evil Morty had understood what that meant in a way that the audience had not. Living inside the curve meant living inside a universe defined by Rick's dominance. Getting out of the curve meant accessing a multiverse where Rick's particular brand of genius was not the organizing principle of reality. Evil Morty escaped. He blew a hole in the wall of the curve and walked through it, and the show left him there, on the other side, in dimensions that the audience had never seen and that the show had never visited. That exit was one of the most genuinely open endings the show had ever produced. Evil Morty was not defeated. He was not redeemed. He was not killed. He simply left, and the implication was that he had gotten what he wanted: freedom from the gravitational pull of a universe organized around Rick Sanchez. For 2 seasons, the show honored that exit. Evil Morty did not reappear in Season 6 or Season 7. The hole he had blown in the central finite curve was treated as a permanent change to the show's cosmology, a structural alteration rather than a plot point to be reversed. The multiverse was different because of what he had done. The show did not try to walk that back. Season 9 brings him back, and the way it brings him back is where the mystery begins. The premiere episode, There's Something About Morty, opens with Morty discovering that Rick has been secretly texting Evil Morty. The texting detail is small but significant. Rick and Evil Morty have been in communication, voluntarily, over a period of time that the episode does not specify. This is not a reunion forced by circumstance. It is a relationship that has been quietly maintained, off-screen, between the end of Season 5 and the beginning of Season 9. The show does not explain when the communication started, or what its early content looked like, or what Rick was getting out of it. It simply presents the fact of the communication as something that has been happening, and leaves the audience to work out what that means. The surface-level explanation that the episode offers is coercion. Evil Morty has rebuilt the Omega device, a weapon previously associated with Rick Prime that has the capacity to erase every version of a specific person across the entire multiverse simultaneously. He has used the device to take hostage what he describes as the nicest Smith family in existence, a version of Rick's family from an ideal dimension, and he is leveraging that threat to compel Rick's cooperation. The cooperation involves helping Evil Morty defeat a cosmic entity called the Collective, a hive mind that is consuming dimensions within the central finite curve in its pursuit of universal knowledge. Rick agrees to help because the alternative is the erasure of every version of his family everywhere. That explanation is clean and functional, and it accounts for the basic mechanics of the episode's plot, but it does not account for something that the episode keeps returning to in ways that suggest the surface explanation is not the full one. Throughout the mission against the Collective, the dynamic between Rick and Evil Morty displays a quality that coercion alone does not produce. They work together with a fluency that implies familiarity. They anticipate each other's moves in the way that people who have spent time together do. At one point, the episode explicitly frames their intellectual chemistry as something that Morty finds threatening. Not because Evil Morty is dangerous, but because Morty can see that Rick enjoys working with him. The enjoyment is real. The show does not try to hide it or explain it away. After the Collective is defeated, the three of them sit in a diner, and Evil Morty begins probing Morty's insecurities with surgical precision. He jokes about replacing Morty. He suggests that Rick does not need Morty the way Morty needs Rick. He says, directly and without apparent malice, that he might steal Rick not because he loves him, but because Morty does. This is not the behavior of a character who is purely strategic. A purely strategic Evil Morty would have no interest in Morty's emotional state. He would care only about Rick's compliance, which he already has through the Omega device. The fact that he takes time to destabilize Morty emotionally, in a moment when the mission is already complete and the leverage is still intact, suggests something operating beneath the strategic layer. The episode eventually reveals that Rick had been working against Evil Morty throughout the entire partnership. He had hidden the blueprints for the Omega device inside the device itself, ensuring that when the device was destroyed, the plans vanished with it. The betrayal was premeditated. Rick had been cooperating with his own blackmailer while simultaneously engineering his escape from the blackmail, which is a characteristically Rick Sanchez approach to an impossible situation. But the revelation raises a question the episode does not answer. If Rick had been planning the betrayal from the beginning, if the cooperation was always tactical rather than genuine, then what explains the ease and fluency of their working relationship during the mission? Tactical cooperation does not produce the kind of intellectual intimacy the episode puts on screen. Evil Morty's response to the betrayal is the detail that opens the deepest question about his character. He does not respond with cold calculation. He does not execute a backup plan or deploy a contingency he had prepared in advance. He attacks. He launches a direct, emotionally charged assault on the Smith family inside a fortified bunker dimension. The attack is effective, but it is also personal in a way that a detached, strategic operator would not allow himself. Detachment would have produced a more controlled response. What Evil Morty does instead looks, from a certain angle, like hurt.
The mid-credit scene of the premiere then places Evil Morty under arrest by time cops for violations involving time manipulation. He is imprisoned in a time prison, the nature and security level of which the episode leaves deliberately unclear. The imprisonment is the kind of ending that functions as a pause rather than a conclusion. Evil Morty is contained, for now, in a facility whose rules and limitations the show has not explained. The audience does not know whether the time prison can hold him. It does not know what resources Evil Morty has access to from inside it, or whether the time cops who arrested him understand what they are actually dealing with. The scene closes before any of those questions can be asked, let alone answered. What Season 9 seems to be building across these early episodes is a version of Evil Morty that is significantly more psychologically complex than the character who escaped through the curve in Season 5. The Season 5 Evil Morty was magnificent in his clarity. He knew exactly what he wanted, exactly what he was willing to do to get it, and exactly what the system he was dismantling meant and why it needed to go. He was the show's most coherent ideological statement, a character who had understood the machinery of the Rick and Morty dynamic well enough to dismantle it from the inside. His exit through the curve was satisfying precisely because it was clean. He won, he left. The story felt finished. The Season 9 Evil Morty is not clean. He has come back from the dimensions beyond the curve, which were supposed to represent freedom from the Rick-centered universe, and he has come back seeking something. The show has not yet specified what that something is. The Omega device and the Collective provided immediate tactical justifications for his return. But tactical justifications do not explain why a character who successfully escaped the gravitational pull of Rick Sanchez's world would choose to re-enter it. They do not explain the emotional charge of his interactions with both Rick and Morty. They do not explain why, after everything, he is still in orbit. The question that Season 9 has raised, and that 7 episodes remain to address or deliberately avoid addressing, is whether Evil Morty's return represents a new phase in his development or a regression to the patterns he was supposed to have escaped. A character who dismantled the central finite curve to free himself from a Rick-defined universe and then came back to orbit around a Rick anyway is a character who has not fully escaped what he thought he had escaped. That reading would make Evil Morty one of the show's most honest portraits of the difficulty of genuine change. People, and characters, do not simply leave their formative patterns behind by walking through a door. The patterns come with them. The curve may be gone, but the psychology that the curve produced is still present in every interaction Evil Morty chooses to have. What he is actually becoming, across the arc of Season 9, is something the show has not yet told us. He is in a time prison. He may escape, he may not. He may reappear in a form that answers some of these questions, or he may reappear in a form that compounds them. The 8 remaining episodes of the season are carrying the weight of one of the show's most genuinely open character questions, and the answer, when it comes, will determine whether Evil Morty's return was a development or a repetition. That distinction matters more than it might seem. A show that brings back its most compelling antagonist only to put him through motions he has already completed is a show that does not fully trust the work it has already done. A show that brings him back to discover something genuinely new about him is a show that understands its own characters well enough to surprise itself. Season 9 has raised the question. The answer is still being written. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 6 sat with the deepest question Evil Morty's return raises. Not what he did, but what his return means for a character who was supposed to have already found his way out. Next, we look at the cosmic architecture beneath that return, the central finite curve that Evil Morty destroyed, and what the Collective's hunger for it implies about what the multiverse looks like now that its walls have been taken down. Section 7. The Collective and the Central Finite Curve. Some ideas in television are introduced and then quietly retired. They serve their purpose in the episode that presents them. They generate the necessary dramatic energy, and then the show moves on, and the idea recedes into the background where it lives as a piece of established lore that gets referenced occasionally, but never fully examined again. The Central Finite Curve is not one of those ideas. It is the kind of structural revelation that, once introduced, changes the meaning of everything that
that came before it and everything that comes after it. When Season 5 revealed the Curve's existence and then immediately destroyed it, the show made a commitment. It committed to a multiverse that would, from that point forward, be genuinely different from the multiverse the audience had been watching for 4 seasons. Season 9's introduction of the Collective is the first real test of whether the show intends to honor that commitment or quietly pretend the Curve's destruction did not change as much as it appeared to. To understand what the Collective's appearance implies, it is worth spending time with what the Central Finite Curve actually was and what its destruction actually meant. The Curve, as Evil Morty explained in the Season 5 finale, was not a natural feature of the multiverse. It was a constructed boundary, a wall within infinite reality that separated a specific subset of dimensions from everything else. The dimensions inside the Curve shared one defining characteristic. In every single one of them, a version of Rick Sanchez was the smartest being in the universe. The Curve was, in other words, a bubble of Rick's supremacy, a self-contained portion of the multiverse where the organizing principle of reality was that Rick always won. Rick was always the cleverest. Rick's particular brand of genius was always the highest expression of intelligence available. The implications of that revelation were considerable. Every adventure Rick and Morty had ever gone on, across 5 seasons and more than 50 episodes, had taken place inside that bubble. Every alien civilization they had encountered, every dimension they had visited, every threat they had faced and overcome, all of it existed within a portion of the multiverse that had been curated, whether intentionally or not, to confirm Rick's worldview. The infinite universe of the show was not actually infinite. It was a managed subset of infinity, and the management had been organized around making Rick feel like the most important thing in it. Evil Morty's destruction of the Curve opened the door to dimensions where that was not true. Dimensions where Rick's intelligence was not the ceiling of what was possible. Dimensions where the rules that governed Rick's universe, the rules he had built his entire identity around understanding and exploiting, did not necessarily apply. The show gestured toward this in the finale, but did not follow Evil Morty through the door he had blown open. It watched him go, and then turned back to the Smith family garage and continued building stories within the portion of the multiverse that remained familiar. Seasons 6, 7, and 8 engaged with the Curve's destruction primarily through the Rick Prime storyline, which used the broken Curve as a plot mechanism without fully exploring what a post-Curve multiverse actually looked like in practice. Rick Prime existed in dimensions that had been outside the Curve, which was why he had been difficult to track. The Curve's destruction made more of the multiverse accessible in narrative terms, but the show used that accessibility to pursue a specific revenge storyline, rather than to explore the broader cosmological implications of what Evil Morty had done. The post-Curve multiverse remained largely off-screen, a space that the show acknowledged without inhabiting. Season 9's introduction of the Collective is the first time the show has directly engaged with what exists in the multiverse beyond the Curve's former boundaries, and the picture it paints is genuinely unsettling. The Collective is described as a hive-mind entity that consumes universes within the Central Finite Curve in its pursuit of total knowledge. Several details in that description warrant careful attention. The first is that the Collective is operating within the Curve's former territory, which means it is operating in dimensions that were previously protected by the Curve's boundary. The second is that it is absorbing these dimensions, rather than simply passing through them, which implies a kind of consumption that the show frames as existential, rather than merely destructive. The third is that its method of gaining power involves absorbing portal technology, which is the specific technology that defined Rick's dominance within the Curve for its entire existence. The question that the Collective's existence raises, and that the premiere resolves only partially, is what it was doing before the Curve was destroyed. A hive-mind entity powerful enough to consume entire universes does not simply appear from nowhere in Season 9. It exists somewhere in the prior history of the multiverse. If it was always present in the dimensions beyond the Curve, then the Curve may have served a function that neither Rick nor Evil Morty fully understood when they were arguing about its meaning. The Curve kept Rick-adjacent universes safe from the Collective, not because it was designed to do so, but because its existence as a boundary prevented the Collective from accessing those dimensions. The destruction of the Curve, in this reading, did not just free Evil Morty from Rick's gravitational pull. It opened a door that had been keeping something out. The show does not make this argument explicitly. The premiere defeats the Collective before it can do serious damage to the Central Finite Curve's former territory, and the defeat is treated as a resolution rather than as the opening of a larger question. But the resolution is incomplete in ways that the episode itself acknowledges. The Collective is described as a hive mind, which is a category of entity that is defined by its distributed nature. A hive mind does not have a single point of failure. Defeating the portion of the Collective that Rick, Morty, and Evil Morty encountered in in the premiere does not necessarily mean defeating the collective as a whole. The episode does not address this. It simply has evil Morty trick the entity into absorbing itself, which is a clever solution to the immediate problem, and then moves on to the diner scene, where the emotional fallout of the mission becomes the focus. The mechanism of the defeat is itself worth examining. Evil Morty's solution involves causing the collective to absorb itself, essentially redirecting its consuming nature back toward its own structure. This works because the collective's drive toward total knowledge is indiscriminate. It absorbs whatever it encounters, and if what it encounters is itself, it absorbs that too. The elegance of the solution is real, but it raises a question about what a self-absorbed collective actually means in cosmological terms. Is it destroyed? Is it contained within itself in some recursive loop? Is the knowledge it had already absorbed preserved or lost? The show defeats the collective without fully explaining what defeating it means, which is either a narrative shortcut or a deliberate ambiguity that future episodes may return to. What the post-curve multiverse actually looks like, beyond the specific dimensions the show visits, remains one of Season 9's most genuinely unanswered questions. Evil Morty spent an unspecified period of time in those dimensions before returning in the premiere. He came back changed, which the show demonstrates through the emotional complexity of his interactions rather than through any direct statement about what he experienced. But what he found out there, what the dimensions beyond the curve contained, what kinds of intelligence and civilization and cosmic entity exist in a multiverse not organized around Rick's genius, none of this has been addressed. Evil Morty is the only character who has been there and come back, and the show has not yet asked him to describe what he saw. That silence is one of the more interesting structural choices Season 9 has made so far. Evil Morty's time beyond the curve is the show's most direct window into a portion of the multiverse it has never depicted, and the show is keeping that window closed. Whether it opens later in the season, whether Evil Morty's imprisonment in the time prison becomes the context in which some of that information is revealed, whether the post-curve multiverse becomes a significant setting in the episodes ahead, these are questions that the current episode count cannot answer. 2 episodes have aired. 8 remain. The collective appeared and was defeated in the first episode. Its appearance raised questions that the first episode did not have time to address. What the remaining episodes choose to do with those questions will determine whether the collective was a Season 9 mystery or simply a Season 9 plot device. There is a deeper implication lurking underneath all of this that the show has not yet surfaced, but that the structure of the mythology seems to be pointing toward. If the central finite curve existed to keep Rick-dominant universes separate from the rest of the multiverse, and if the rest of the multiverse contains entities like the collective that consume universes for knowledge, then the multiverse beyond the curve may be a significantly more dangerous place than the show's first 5 seasons implied. Evil Morty escaped to freedom, but freedom, in a multiverse without the curve's protection, may not be the clean liberation he imagined it to be. The dimensions he accessed may be older, stranger, and more hostile than anything the show has previously depicted. That possibility, that the curve's destruction opened Rick's universe not just to freedom but to exposure, is a reading the show has not confirmed but also has not contradicted. The collective's presence within the former curve territory is consistent with it. An entity that was held at bay by the curve's boundary would naturally move into that territory once the boundary was removed. If that reading is correct, then Evil Morty's great act of liberation may have also been an act of considerable danger, not just for Rick and the Smith family, but for every version of every person who ever lived inside the curve's protection. Season 9 has 8 episodes left to decide whether it wants to explore that possibility or let it remain a background implication. The central finite curve is gone. What that absence means for the multiverse as a whole, and for the characters who are trying to live in the space it left behind, is a question the season is still in the process of asking. The answer, when it comes, will say a great deal about how seriously the show takes its own cosmological commitments. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 7 looked at what the collective's existence implies about the multiverse after the curve's destruction, and the questions that defeat left unanswered. Next, we go deeper into the weapon at the center of Season 9's premiere, the Omega device, and the troubling question of how Evil Morty rebuilt something that was supposed to belong exclusively to the most dangerous Rick who ever lived. Section 8, the Omega device and Rick Prime's shadow. Some weapons in fiction are scary because of what they do. Others are scary because of what they imply about the person who made them. The Omega device belongs to the second category. Its function, erasing every version of a specific person across the entire multiverse by killing a single variant of them, is disturbing enough on its own terms. The capacity to commit a form of multiversal genocide with a single targeted action is the kind of power that the show does not introduce lightly. But the more unsettling quality of the Omega device is not what it does. It is what its existence says about the mind that conceived it.
Building a weapon capable of erasing someone from every dimension simultaneously requires a specific kind of intelligence, combined with a specific kind of intention. It requires someone who has thought carefully and deliberately about how to make a person disappear not just from one reality, but from all of them at once. That person was Rick Prime, and the fact that his weapon is back in Season 9, rebuilt and operational, is one of the season's most quietly troubling details. Rick Prime was introduced in Season 6 as the darkest possible version of the show's central character, where Rick C-137, the Rick the audience has followed since the pilot, is a deeply damaged person who nonetheless maintains genuine emotional connections to the people around him. Rick Prime was something colder. He was a Rick who had made the choice, at a fundamental level, that other people simply did not matter. The backstory that Season 6 and 7 gradually assembled around him was one of deliberate abandonment. He had visited the dimension of Rick C-137, seen the life that Rick C-137 was building with his wife Diane and their daughter Beth, and walked away from it. Not because he was incapable of connection, but because he had decided that connection was beneath him. He had calculated the cost of caring about people and concluded the cost was too high, and then he had spent the rest of his existence acting on that conclusion, with a consistency that Rick C-137, for all his nihilistic posturing, has never been able to achieve. The Omega device was Rick Prime's creation. It was the ultimate expression of his worldview, rendered in technological form. A weapon that does not just kill someone, but eliminates every version of them across infinite reality, is a weapon built by someone who understands the multiverse deeply enough to know that killing a single variant of a person is, in a cosmos of infinite dimensions, almost meaningless. Rick Prime thought in multiversal terms. He understood that if you wanted to truly erase someone, you had to erase all of them, simultaneously, everywhere. The Omega device was the practical solution to that problem. It was also a portrait of a mind that had spent serious time thinking about how to make existence itself reversible for other people, while remaining irreversible for itself. Rick C-137 killed Rick Prime in the Season 7 finale. The revenge arc that had been building across 2 seasons reached its conclusion in a confrontation that the show played with deliberate emotional restraint. Rick Prime did not die heroically or dramatically. He died as he had lived, as someone who had chosen disconnection so completely that even the moment of his death carried no real weight for him. The Omega device, by the logic of that ending, should have died with him. The blueprints for a weapon of that specificity and that complexity were Rick Prime's intellectual property in the most literal possible sense. They existed because he had designed them. With him gone, the reasonable assumption was that the weapon was gone too. Season 9 opens with that assumption proven wrong. Evil Morty has rebuilt the Omega device. He demonstrates its functionality by using it to take hostage the nicest Smith family in existence, threatening Rick with the erasure of every version of his family across the multiverse if Rick does not cooperate. The device works. It is operational. It is every bit as dangerous as the original. And the episode moves past this fact with a briskness that does not invite the audience to pause on its implications, which is itself a signal that the implications are worth pausing on independently. The question the episode does not address is how. How did Evil Morty rebuild the Omega device? The weapon was Rick Prime's creation. Rick Prime is dead. The blueprints for the device were not public knowledge within the show's established mythology. They were not sitting in a Citadel database or circulating among Rick variants as an example of impressive engineering. They were the product of a specific, extraordinarily intelligent mind that had spent years developing them in isolation. For Evil Morty to rebuild the device, he would need access to those blueprints, or the intelligence to derive them independently. The episode offers neither explanation. The most straightforward possibility is that Evil Morty accessed the blueprints during his time beyond the central finite curve. Rick Prime existed primarily outside the curve, in dimensions that were not organized around any Rick's dominance. Evil Morty's exit through the curve brought him into that same territory. If Rick Prime had stored copies of the Omega device blueprints in dimensions beyond the curve, Evil Morty could have encountered them during his time out there. This would explain the access without requiring Evil Morty to have independently derived a weapon of that complexity, which would be a significant claim about his capabilities, even given everything the show has established about his intelligence. But this explanation, if it is the correct one, raises its own question. Rick Prime was a character defined by his caution and his paranoia about his own vulnerability. He was not the kind of person who left copies of his most dangerous weapons scattered across dimensions he did not control. The Omega device was his leverage, his ultimate option, the thing he could reach for if the situation demanded total erasure
erasure of a threat. Leaving the blueprints in accessible locations would have been inconsistent with the intelligence and the paranoia that defined him. If Evil Morty found the blueprints in the dimensions beyond the curve, he found them because Rick Prime left them there deliberately, which implies a level of premeditation about the post-Prime era that the show has not previously suggested Rick Prime engaged in. The alternative explanation is more unsettling. Evil Morty is, by the show's own accounting, one of the most intelligent Mortys in the history of the multiverse. He organized the Citadel from within, manipulated every Rick in existence simultaneously, and destroyed the central finite curve using knowledge and capabilities that no other Morty had developed. It is not impossible that a Morty of that intelligence, given unspecified time in the dimensions beyond the curve, with access to whatever resources and knowledge those dimensions contained, could derive the Omega device's underlying principles independently. The curve, after all, contained every dimension where Rick was the smartest being in the universe. The dimensions beyond the curve, by definition, contained beings smarter than Rick. Evil Morty, in those dimensions, would have had access to intelligence that surpassed anything available inside the curve. What he learned out there, and from whom, is a question the show has not answered. Rick's solution to the Omega device problem is characteristically elegant and characteristically deceptive. He hides the blueprints for the device inside the device itself, ensuring that when the device is destroyed, the blueprints are destroyed with it. The solution erases the weapon's reproducibility, not just the weapon. It is a Rick Sanchez answer to a Rick Prime problem, using the same kind of multiversal thinking that created the device in the first place, but turned toward elimination rather than leverage. The move is brilliant. It is also, in its own way, an acknowledgement of how seriously Rick takes the threat the device represents. He does not simply destroy it. He destroys the idea of it, the possibility of it being made again. That level of thoroughness is not Rick being clever for the sake of it. It is Rick being genuinely scared. What Rick's fear reveals is that the Omega device occupies a different category of threat than almost anything else in the show's mythology. Rick has faced existential threats before. He has navigated situations where his own death was a real possibility, and has done so with varying degrees of equanimity. The Omega device is threatening not because it can kill Rick, but because it can kill everyone Rick loves across every version of reality simultaneously. It targets the thing Rick has spent the entire series pretending he does not have: genuine attachment to specific people, and uses that attachment as a lever. Against a weapon designed to exploit emotional connection, Rick's usual defensive strategy of pretending not to care is useless. The device knows he cares before he does. Rick Prime built a weapon that was perfectly designed to hurt Rick C-137 specifically. That specificity is worth sitting with. The Omega device is not a general-purpose weapon. It is a weapon whose most devastating application is against someone who has a large family spread across multiple dimensions and who would be destroyed by the knowledge that his actions had caused their simultaneous erasure. Rick Prime understood his counterpart well enough to design a weapon calibrated to his particular vulnerability. That understanding implies a level of attention that contradicts the narrative of complete disconnection that Rick Prime presented. People who truly do not care about someone do not spend time designing weapons perfectly calibrated to that person's specific emotional architecture. Season 9 has destroyed the Omega device and its blueprints, but it has not destroyed the question of how Evil Morty rebuilt it, or what that rebuilding implies about what he encountered beyond the curve, or what other pieces of Rick Prime's legacy might still be circulating in the multiverse in forms that the show has not yet addressed. Rick Prime is dead. His weapon was rebuilt once already. The assumption that it cannot be rebuilt again rests on Rick's solution having been thorough enough to eliminate every copy of the blueprints from every dimension. Rick believed it was thorough enough. Rick has been wrong before. The shadow Rick Prime casts over Season 9 is not the shadow of a defeated villain. It is the shadow of an idea. The idea that in a multiverse of infinite dimensions, truly eliminating something, truly making it gone, everywhere and forever, may be beyond even Rick Sanchez's considerable capabilities. The Omega device appeared, was deployed, and was destroyed in the space of a single episode. But the knowledge that it can be built, and that someone other than Rick Prime has now demonstrated the ability to build it, is not something that disappears when the episode ends. It stays in the room. It changes what the stakes of the remaining season feel like. And it raises a question about Rick Prime's legacy that the show may or may not choose to answer before Season 9 concludes. What Rick Prime left behind is still out there in some form. Season 9 has already shown that once. Whether it shows it again is one of the season's most genuinely open questions. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 8 examined the Omega device's return and the troubling gap in the show's explanation of how Evil Morty rebuilt a dead man's most dangerous weapon. happen. Next, we turn to something closer to home. The question of what Rick's sacrifice of his Diane memories at the end of Season 8 actually did to him, and whether Season 9's opening episodes suggest the sacrifice worked the way Rick needed it to. Section 9. Rick's existential crisis and the memory of Diane. There is a specific kind of grief that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the clarity of an acute loss, the sharp and unmistakable pain of something being taken from you in a moment you can identify and point to. It arrives instead as a background condition, a persistent, low-level disturbance in the way a person moves through the world, a quality of absence that is difficult to name because the person experiencing it cannot fully remember what is missing. That kind of grief is harder to treat than the obvious kind because the sufferer cannot grieve directly. They cannot mourn a specific thing. They can only feel the shape of a hole without being able to see what used to fill it. Season 8 ended with Rick Sanchez choosing that kind of grief deliberately, sacrificing his memories of Diane so that something about their relationship, some quality of feeling that had become too dangerous to carry intact, could be removed from his emotional architecture. Season 9 is showing what that choice looks like in practice, and the picture is not a comfortable one. The sacrifice of the Diane memories was Season 8's most significant emotional development. The show had been building toward a reckoning with Diane since the Season 6 revelation that Rick Prime's visit to Rick C-137's dimension had been the catalyst for Diane's death. Rick C-137's entire post-Diane existence, the genius, the nihilism, the alcohol, the portal gun, the adventures, all of it had grown in the soil of that specific loss. Diane was not just a character in Rick's backstory. She was the organizing trauma of the show's central character, the thing that explained why Rick was the way he was, and why he could not stop being that way, regardless of what he experienced or learned or survived. Her absence was the engine of his psychology. Season 8 made the decision to remove that engine, or at least to remove Rick's conscious access to it. The sacrifice was framed as something Rick chose, rather than something that was done to him, which is an important distinction. Rick did not lose his Diane memories involuntarily. He gave them up deliberately, in a moment that the show played with the kind of emotional restraint it reserves for its most serious material. The reasoning behind the choice was not spelled out explicitly, which is consistent with the way the show handles Rick's most significant emotional decisions. He does not explain himself when he does something that costs him something real. He simply does it and moves on, or tries to. Season 9's second episode, titled Rick's Days, 7 Nights, is the most direct engagement the season has offered so far with what the sacrifice actually did to Rick. The episode places Rick in an environment that the audience gradually understands is not his real life. He is on an alien planet going by the name Ted, living among a community of friends who know him as someone he is not. He has a routine. He goes to a bowling alley called Dream Lanes, owned by a woman named Marjorie, and he spends his evenings with a group of people who have built a relationship with the version of him that exists in that place. The life he has constructed there has the texture of something real. The relationships feel genuine. The warmth between Ted and his bowling alley community is not performed or hollow. It is the kind of warmth that requires time and repetition and the willingness to show up consistently. The episode does not immediately explain how Rick came to be living as Ted on an alien planet or how long he has been there. It presents the situation as a given and then slowly introduces the elements that will destabilize it. An armed robbery at a liquor store triggers Rick's cybernetics in a way that reveals to him and to the audience simultaneously that Ted is not who he appears to be. The revelation that he is actually Rick Sanchez, that the life he has been living is a constructed identity rather than his genuine self, sends Rick into a spiral that the episode follows with unusual patience. He does not immediately reassemble himself and return to the garage. He panics. He leaves. He tries to process what he has discovered while remaining in the environment that the discovery has made untenable. The panic is significant because it is not the kind of panic Rick usually displays. Rick's normal response to discovered pretense is a kind of sardonic acknowledgement, a shrug that says he knew what he was doing all along and was never fooled by it. What the second episode of Season 9 shows instead is a Rick who appears to have been genuinely invested in the Ted identity, who is destabilized not just by the discovery of the pretense, but by what the discovery implies about why he needed the pretense in the first place. He was not running a con, he was hiding, and the hiding had been so thorough that some part of him had forgotten that it was hiding. The Diane question sits underneath all of this in a way the episode makes visible without stating directly. Rick, without his Diane memories, is a Rick who has lost the narrative thread of his own damage. He knows, in some abstract sense, that his life has been defined by loss, but the specific content of that loss, the particular face and voice and presence that the loss was the loss of,
has been removed. What remains is the shape of the grief without the grief's object. That shape still exerts pressure. It still drives behavior. Rick's construction of the Ted identity on an alien planet, his creation of a community built around a false name, his investment in a bowling alley and a group of friends who do not know who he actually is. All of this looks, from a certain angle, like someone trying to fill the shape of something they can feel but cannot see. Marjorie's presence in the episode adds a layer that the show handles with considerable delicacy. She is not a romantic interest in any straightforward sense. She is something more specific and more interesting than that. She is a person who knows Ted, who has built a genuine relationship with the version of Rick that presented itself in her bowling alley, and who is, in the episode's most quietly painful sequence, killed during the fight with the drones that come to retrieve Rick. Her death is not played for shock. It is played for loss, the specific and irreversible loss of someone who mattered to a version of Rick that no longer has the right to exist once the real Rick has been remembered into place. The episode ends with Rick returning to the Smith family, who are unimpressed by whatever he has been doing and largely uninterested in the emotional texture of his absence. Beth is irritated, Summer is indifferent, Jerry is arguing with Beth about a garbage disposal. The domestic mundanity that greets Rick's return is deliberate and exactly right. He has come back from an existential crisis that involved the death of someone he cared about in an identity he constructed to survive the loss of something he cannot fully remember, and the house he returns to is having an argument about a garbage disposal. The gap between the internal experience and the external reception is where the show locates a significant portion of its emotional intelligence. The question that the episode raises, and does not answer, is whether the Diane sacrifice is working. The construction of the Ted identity suggests that whatever the sacrifice was supposed to accomplish, whatever relief or stability or forward motion Rick hoped removing those memories would provide, has not been straightforwardly achieved. The grief that drove Rick before the sacrifice is still present in the behavior. The Ted identity is not the behavior of a healed person. It is the behavior of a person who has found a new way to manage damage they cannot directly access. The method has changed, the underlying condition has not. This possibility, that removing the memories of Diane did not remove the damage Diane's loss created, but only removed Rick's ability to understand why he is damaged, is one of the most troubling implications Season 9 has raised so far. There is a version of this story where the sacrifice works, where Rick gradually stabilizes and becomes something closer to functional in the absence of the specific grief that drove him. There is another version where the sacrifice made things worse, where Rick is now navigating the consequences of a formative trauma without the ability to identify the trauma as the source of his behavior. The second version is significantly darker than the first, and significantly more consistent with what Season 9 has shown so far. The show's history with Rick's psychology is relevant here. Rick has, across 9 seasons, demonstrated a consistent pattern of choosing solutions that address the symptoms of his damage rather than the damage itself. He medicates with alcohol, he distracts with adventure, he maintains control through intelligence and forward motion. When stillness threatens, he creates complexity to fill it. The sacrifice of the Diane memories fits that pattern almost perfectly. It is a solution that removes the most visible evidence of the problem without addressing the structural cause of it. It is Rick doing surgery on himself with the same tools he uses to avoid surgery. Intelligence applied not toward genuine healing, but toward the management of pain in a way that leaves the pain's source intact. Season 9 has 8 episodes, of which only 2 have aired at the time of writing. The existential crisis that the second episode depicts is presumably not the season's final word on Rick's psychological state. Something ahead in the remaining episodes will develop this further, either by pushing Rick deeper into the instability the crisis represents, or by providing some form of resolution that addresses what the sacrifice has and has not accomplished. Whether that resolution takes the form of a recovered memory, a confrontation with what the sacrifice cost him, or something the show has not yet signaled, is a question the audience will have to wait to see answered. What is already clear from the 2 episodes that exist is that Season 9 is taking Rick's interior life seriously in a way that the show does not always commit to. The Ted identity, the existential spiral, the quiet grief of Marjorie's death, the return to a house that greets his crisis with indifference. These are the details of a character study rather than a plot machine. Season 9 is interested in what Rick is like when the adventure stops, and the performance of not caring becomes too expensive to maintain. It is interested in what lives underneath the genius and the nihilism, and the carefully constructed armor of someone who decided, a long time ago, that feeling things fully was more dangerous than not feeling them at all. The memory of Diane is gone. The damage is not. And the gap between those 2 facts is where Season 9 is doing some of its most honest and most patient work. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Section 9 followed the thread of Rick's psychological state after the Diane sacrifice, and what Season 9's early episodes suggest about whether that sacrifice actually brought the relief Rick was looking for. Next, we arrive at the season's final and perhaps most intriguing mystery, the title of the finale itself, Field of Dreams, and what a show built on nihilism and multiverse logic might possibly mean by ending on a phrase that carries that much weight. Fall asleep to every Rick and Morty Season 9 mystery plus unanswered questions. Season 9 of Rick and Morty ends on July 26, 2026, and nobody outside that production knows what happens in it. The finale is called Field of Dreams, not a Rick and Morty pun. Not a wordplay title with a syllable swapped and a Morty inserted somewhere it does not belong. The exact name of a 1989 film about a man who builds something impossible because a voice told him to, because something he lost a long time ago might find its way back if the right space is waiting for it. That is the title the writers chose for the last episode of a season that opened with Rick being blackmailed by the most dangerous version of his own grandson, placed him inside a false identity on an alien planet bowling with strangers who did not know his real name, and left evil Morty locked inside a time prison with 8 episodes still to go. The questions this season is carrying have been building since May. Tonight, this video walks through all of them, one at a time, slowly. Welcome to Ricktopus. Subscribing is free, and it genuinely helps. Let us get into it. Section 10. What the title of the final episode means. There is a particular kind of attention that a title deserves when it belongs to the final episode of a season. Not every finale title rewards that attention. Many are functional, descriptive, a summary of the plot that will unfold within the episode, rather than a signal of something deeper. But occasionally, a show chooses a finale title that is doing more than describing. It is making a statement. It is planting a flag in a specific piece of emotional or philosophical territory and daring the audience to think about why that particular territory was chosen, what it means for the season that preceded it, and what it implies about the show's understanding of itself and its characters. Rick and Morty Season 9's finale is titled Field of Dreams. In a show built on nihilism, multiverse logic, the systematic deconstruction of hope, and the repeated demonstration that wanting things is the first step toward being destroyed by not having them, that title is either the most ironic joke the writer's room has ever constructed or a genuine signal about where the season is going. Working out which one it is, or whether it is somehow both simultaneously, is the final mystery Season 9 has placed in front of its audience. The phrase Field of Dreams carries an enormous amount of cultural weight before the show does anything with it. The 1989 Kevin Costner film, from which the phrase most immediately derives, is a story about a man who hears a voice in a cornfield telling him to build a baseball diamond, and who builds it, and who discovers that the act of building something in response to an impossible promise is itself the point. The film is fundamentally about faith. Not religious faith in any narrow doctrinal sense, but the broader human capacity to act on belief in the absence of evidence, to construct something real in response to something imagined, and to find that the construction itself has a value that the original imagined promise could not have provided. It is a film about a man who does something that makes no rational sense, and finds that the irrational act was the only one that could have given him what he actually needed. Placing that phrase at the end of a Rick and Morty season is a provocation. Rick Sanchez is the show's most comprehensive argument against faith of any kind. He does not act on belief in the absence of evidence. He builds evidence before he acts. Or he acts on calculations so rapid and so thorough that they approximate certainty in real time. He has no patience for the irrational, and no respect for the idea that doing something that makes no rational sense might be precisely the right response to certain situations. He has spent 9 seasons demonstrating, through behavior and through argument, that the universe does not reward the kind of faith the Field of Dreams narrative is built on. The universe, in Rick's view, does not reward anything. It is indifferent. It does not care whether you build the baseball diamond or not, and yet he keeps building things anyway. That tension is where the title lives. Season 9 has spent its first 2 episodes showing a Rick who built a bowling alley community under a false name on an alien planet. A Rick who invested in relationships that had no strategic value. A Rick who was genuinely destabilized by the death of a woman named Marjorie, whom he had known only as Ted, who had no business caring about in any framework he would publicly acknowledge. A Rick who, when the false identity was stripped away and the real self was remembered into place, did not return to the garage with the breezy indifference he performs so consistently. He returned, hollowed out, carrying something that the garbage disposal argument
argument could not touch and that he had no language for. That Rick, the one visible in Season 9's early episodes, is a Rick who has already been doing something that makes no rational sense. He built something in response to an impossible need. The Ted identity was not a con or a tactical maneuver. It was a field of dreams. It was a man constructing something he believed in because the alternative was sitting alone with the shape of a grief he could not name. The finale title, if it is pointing at something real rather than performing irony, may be the season's way of signaling that what Rick built as Ted, and what he lost when Ted was taken away, is not finished. That the season is moving towards something that requires Rick to confront the relationship between his capacity for faith and his philosophical rejection of it.
The episode titles that precede the finale offer partial clues about the trajectory the season is following. The first episode established Evil Morty's return and the Omega device threat. The second placed Rick in an existential crisis inside a false identity. The third, Rick Fu Hustle, suggests action and movement, a Rick who is doing something rather than hiding. The fourth, A Ricker Runs Through It, carries a literary reference to Norman Maclean's A River Runs Through It, a story about family, loss, and the things that connect people across the distance their choices create between them. The fifth, Jerbud, centers on Jerry in a way the title suggests is more than a standard Jerry episode. The sixth, Ericerhead, references Eraserhead, David Lynch's film about fatherhood, anxiety, and the horror of responsibility. The seventh, Mort Gully, the last Rick Forrest, plays with the concept of last things, endings, the closing of something that cannot be reopened. The eighth, Requiem Mort a Dream, references Requiem for a Dream, a film about addiction, destruction, and the collapse of people who wanted something so badly they could not survive the wanting. The ninth, Salute Your Morts, lands with a military resonance that implies duty, sacrifice, and the cost of loyalty. Read together, those titles trace an arc that is not primarily comedic. They move through action and family and anxiety and apocalypse and addiction and duty before arriving at Field of Dreams. The arc describes a season that is taking its characters through versions of loss and responsibility and impossible wanting before depositing them in a place that the title suggests is about construction rather than destruction, about the act of building something in the face of uncertainty rather than the act of dismantling everything that cannot be proven necessary. For a show whose central character has spent 9 seasons dismantling things, that trajectory is significant. The question of whether Field of Dreams is ironic or sincere may be the wrong question entirely. The show has always been most interesting when it refuses to choose between those registers, when it holds irony and sincerity in the same frame without resolving the tension between them. The moments that hit hardest in the show's history are almost universally the ones where the comedy steps back and the show simply allows something to be true without comment. The therapist scene in Pickle Rick, Rick's breakdown in the Season 3 episode where he admits what the whole thing is really about, the look on Rick's face in the Season 6 finale when he understands what Rick Prime actually chose and what that choice cost everyone. These are moments where the show drops the ironic armor completely and stands in the open with something genuine. The finale title, Field of Dreams, may be signaling that Season 9 is building toward one of those moments, something that requires the show to stand in the open without the armor and mean what it says. What a Field of Dreams actually represents for Rick Sanchez, in the specific emotional context that Season 9 has been constructing, is something worth thinking about slowly. A Field of Dreams is a place where impossible things are built in response to impossible needs. It is a place where the rational calculus that says this cannot work is overridden by something that operates below the level of calculation. Rick has been living in a version of that place since the Diane memories were taken from him, building things, the Ted identity, the bowling alley community, the investment in Marjorie, that the rational part of him would have identified as too costly and too vulnerable to justify. The sacrifice did not make him more rational. It made him, in a strange way, more human. It removed the specific grief that had organized his damage and left behind something rawer and less structured, something that reached for connection in the way that people reach for connection when they have stopped being able to explain to themselves why connection is a bad idea. The finale title may be pointing at the end of that arc. Not a resolution in the sense of a problem being solved, because Rick Sanchez problems are not the kind that get solved in a single episode or a single season, but a moment of recognition, a moment where Rick encounters the thing he has been building toward without knowing he was building toward it, and where the encounter requires him to decide whether he is going to acknowledge what it is or dismantle it the way he has dismantled everything else that has cost him too much to keep. Fan theories about the finale have been circulating since the season began, and several of them have developed enough internal consistency to
be worth examining carefully.
The most persistent one centers on Morty,
Specifically on the image referenced in early promotional material of Morty standing alone in an open field holding a portal gun with no Rick anywhere near him. That image has generated considerable discussion because of what it implies about the structural relationship between Rick and Morty at the end of the season. Morty, with a portal gun, and no Rick, is not a standard image for this show. The portal gun has always been Rick's instrument. It is the technology that makes the adventures possible, the device that represents Rick's control over the shape of their shared experience. Morty holding it alone in an open field suggests either that Rick has given it to him or that Rick is gone. Neither possibility is a comfortable one. The Morty alone reading connects to something the season's premiere established in its emotional subtext. Evil Morty's dinner table manipulation of Morty was built around the fear of replaceability. He told Morty that he might steal Rick not because he loved him, but because Morty did. That line was designed to destabilize Morty by targeting his deepest insecurity, the fear that his relationship with Rick is asymmetrical in a way that makes him permanently vulnerable. Morty needs Rick more than Rick needs Morty. That asymmetry has been present in the show since the pilot, and the series has never resolved it, only examined it from different angles in different seasons. If the finale is called Field of Dreams, and Morty is standing alone in a field, the season may be moving toward a moment where that asymmetry is forced into the open in a way it has never been before. A second theory, less circulated but structurally interesting, concerns Evil Morty's time prison. The time cops who arrested him at the end of the premiere have not been explained.
their jurisdiction, the rules of the prison they operate, the conditions under which someone arrested for time manipulation violations would serve their sentence. None of this has been addressed by the 2 episodes that have aired. A time prison, by the logic of the show's internal cosmology, is a facility that exists at a specific point in time, which means it can theoretically be accessed by someone with the right technology from either direction along the timeline. Evil Morty inside a time prison is Evil Morty in a location with a fixed temporal address. For a character of his intelligence and resourcefulness, that may be less a sentence and more a staging point. If Evil Morty escapes the time prison, which the show's history with his character suggests is considerably more likely than not, the question becomes what he does with the freedom and what that has to do with a finale called Field of Dreams.
His stated motivation for everything in the premiere was the destruction of the collective and the protection of his autonomy beyond the curve. Both of those objectives were achieved, at least temporarily. The Omega device is gone, the collective has been defeated, Evil Morty is in prison for unrelated reasons. If he escapes into a season that has spent 8 episodes developing themes of impossible construction, faith in the absence of evidence, and the relationship between loss and the things people build to survive it. An Evil Morty operating in that thematic context could be something very different from the calculating mastermind of his earlier appearances. The Jerry episode, Jer Bud, sitting at the season's midpoint, is another element the finale title casts in an interesting light. Jerry Smith has always been the show's most honest portrait of ordinary human limitation. He is not brilliant. He is not exceptional. He wants things he cannot have and settles for less than he deserves and keeps going anyway. Not out of wisdom or resilience, but out of the particular human stubbornness that mistakes persistence for purpose. A season that ends on Field of Dreams, on the idea that building something impossible in response to impossible need has its own value, is a season where Jerry's particular brand of stubborn persistence might actually be revealed as something more than pathetic. Jerry's Field of Dreams has always been his family, the specific and ordinary life he has been trying to hold together across 9 seasons of chaos. If the finale honors that in any direct way, it will be the show doing something it has historically avoided, treating Jerry's limitations as the foundation of something real rather than as a source of comedy. What the title of the final episode means will be answered on July 26, 2026, when Field of Dreams airs on Adult Swim and the audience finally gets to see what the season has been building toward. Until that night, the title sits in the space between what the show has been and what it might be becoming, carrying the weight of everything Season 9 has set in motion. The Diane sacrifice and its incomplete healing, the Ted identity and its genuine loss, Evil Morty's return and his troubling emotional evolution, the Omega device and Rick Prime's lingering shadow, the post-curve multiverse and the things that live in it, all of it moving toward a cornfield, all of it moving toward a man who built something impossible because the alternative was standing still in a grief he could no longer name. The show that began in 2013 with a crude parody of a time travel film built into something that outlasted its co-creator and survived fires that would have ended almost anything else, and arrived arrived in 2026, still being described by reviewers as brilliant and dark and consistently funny, is a show that has itself been a kind of field of dreams. Something built in response to an impossible need, maintained against rational expectation, and still standing in a year when its continued existence is genuinely surprising to everyone, including, probably, the people who make it. Field of Dreams. Whatever it means, it is a title that a show has to earn. Season 9 is in the process of earning it. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.